Okay, so today we're going to talk about avian food and foraging. This is chapter 8 in your book. So, birds are homeothermic, meaning they have to maintain a constant internal body temperature um, that is independent of the external environment. Um, this is the opposite. The opposite of this would be a poikilotherm. This would be any organism whose body temperature is dictated by the external environment. Being poikilothermic has advantages, and being homeothermic has advantages. And birds choose have evolutionarily chose the homeothermic route of life. Um, One of the disadvantages to being a homeotherm is that it requires a lot of energy because the internal body temperature is regulated through metabolic processes. As you metabolize food, the energy production process generates heat. That heat warms the body. So you need energy rich food to fuel a homeothermic body. This includes, anything that birds eat, for the most part, as an energy rich food source. There are some are more energy rich than others, though. Things like fruit, nectar, and animal matter are, relatively more energy rich than, say, leaves. So it's all somewhat relative. But generally, birds focus their efforts on acquiring high energy food sources to fuel this metabolism. There is a pattern between metabolic rate, food consumption, and body mass. And that pattern is this: as body mass increases, um, the amount of food consumed increases as well. But in general, small birds have a high metabolic rate per unit of mass compared to larger birds. And as a result of that, small birds must forage more frequently. Ultimately, there is very high variation in the energy needs of any individual from a given species because energy needs aren't just based on internal factors but also on external factors, including uh, seasonality and environmental conditions. Birds in cold places have to generate uh, more heat uh, or burn more fuel to generate the same amount of heat necessary to maintain uh, an internal constant body temperature. So that requires more energy, of course. Um, that means more consumption, right? And then another example would be birds that are getting ready to migrate need to have enough energy available to them to sustain themselves through a significantly lengthy migration. And here on the left, you can see an example. This is a black pole warbler. What is happening in this picture? This is not a dissection or anything. It might look like that if you're unfamiliar, but that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is actually a bird bander is taking a straw and blowing onto the chest of a black pole warbler. And what you see in this picture is this ridge is the keel of the sternum, and on either side of that, of course, is the pectoralis covered in a transparent layer of skin. And then this orangish, creamish colored stuff that you see all around the pectoralis muscles, that would not be there earlier in the season, say during the breeding portion of the season. That would not be there. That's fat. That's what that is. Those are fat stores. And so what happens is warblers and other migratory species, as they get ready to migrate, they go through a behavioral change called hyperphagia, where they rapidly eat. They eat and eat and eat as much as they can, and they put on fat. A blackpoll warbler has to fly from northern Canada to northern South America twice a year, right? It flies there. It flies south at the end of the summer as the breeding season closes down to South America, and then as breeding season approaches in the spring, it flies all the way back up to Canada again. This is a very, very long flight. It requires a tremendous amount of energy, and this hyperphagia behavior is how the bird stores the energy that it will need to finish that tremendous flight. Um, Birds also have pretty different nutrient requirements. Their diets may lack certain nutrients that are very, very important, and they have to get those sometimes in strange ways, ways maybe that are not ways we would anticipate. So, an example of that can be seen here with these red and green macaws. They are on a cliff face covered in a clay-like soil, and they're eating that soil. And intuitively, you might see, like, that's crazy. Why are they eating soil? The reason they're doing that is because that soil is rich in salt, and the natural diet of the macaws otherwise is very low in salt. So they can get their salt in this other way. Salt is a very, very important nutrient in the body, and without it, you would die. So it's an important resource for them. Another resource that can be very limited in bird diets is calcium. Um, and obviously, calcium is very important not only for bone tissue and for some of its physiological necessities, but also because uh, the shell of the egg is calcium based. And so, if you're a female in particular and you're producing eggs, you need calcium to produce those eggs. Ways that birds might supplement calcium into their diets are by picking at pieces of bone, um, consuming snail shells, or consuming some other calcium rich types of foods. All in all, birds tend to have, or they do really do have, behaviors specific to getting the nutrients that they need from their environment one way or another. If they didn't, they wouldn't be around. Um, yeah, so that's that. This diagram is depicting functional responses. That is, these are models for how we can think about how a bird might change its feeding rate in response to availability of a specific food. And there's three models that we think about: a linear, hyperbolic, and sigmoidal response. The top one is the linear response. Birds don't have a linear response, so before we go and dive too far into this, um, a linear response is a passive form of response where your feeding rate is just a function of the density of the food and the medium you're consuming from. So a sponge and water, for example, if a sponge is just filtering water for food, if we increase the density of food items in the water, the sponge will inevitably, at the same rate we increase density, increase its feeding rate. That I think is fairly intuitive. What might be less intuitive are the ways that non-passive feeders respond to prey density. And that's what you see in B and C. In B, we have the hyperbolic response. Um, and in this response, we have an example of Eurasian oyster catchers feeding on mussels. These guys respond rapidly to easily detectable prey, these mussels, but they slow their consumption rate uh, and become more selective at high prey densities. Uh, Basically, at high prey densities, they can afford to be more selective about uh, which individuals, what they're going to eat. Right? There's plenty of food, and so I can slow down. I'm at what's called the satiation point. I can slow down. I don't need to consume uh, with fervor anymore. And the C is sigmoidal. The sigmoidal one, the sigmoidal response is interesting because the sigmoidal response we have early on as um, prey density is increasing, a very low change in the responsive feeding rate from our predator. In this case, we're looking at a great black-backed gull. Um, so we have a low response, and then all of a sudden it just spikes. It almost goes straight up, and then curves off at the top again. So what's happening there is is the predator figuring out how to exploit this resource once it gets to a certain density. Right? The resource at very low densities, it's hard for the predator to figure out how to exploit that particular resource, or there's literally just not enough for it to be worthwhile. But once you hit a certain density, the predator figures out how to exploit that resource and consumes it, uh, sometimes almost exclusively, because usually once they figure this out, they become very, very good at consuming that prey item. An example of that is like this great blackback gull, which consumes preferentially in some parts of its range this one crab in particular, uh, even more so than other crabs with a higher density. And that's because this bird has figured out how to really hone in on this one prey item, and they're very good at catching this prey item, and so that's the thing that they eat. Okay, so that's functional response. Those are the three types of functional response. All right, optimal foraging theory. Um, Optimal foraging theory is all about answering questions like, what sort of choices are birds going to make when it comes to selecting food, in terms of the time they're going to spend getting food, in terms of um, where they will hunt, um, in terms of the limitations presented, like will the limitations presented to them affect, uh, or well, they will affect, but it models the limitations that they have in terms of prey selection, and it kind of makes determinations about how will those limitations affect what they can eat. What behaviors will the bird employ in its feeding strategies? These are the sorts of things that optimal foraging theory is worried about. Um, a general example of optimal foraging theory in action is with these crows. And so these crows on the coast figured out that they could take a whelk, fly up in the air, drop the whelk. They could do this a few times. The whelk would crack open, and they'd have a very, very energy-rich source of food by doing that. Um, and the an individual saw this, and they asked a simple question: why do they always pick up fairly large whelks, and why do they always fly 5 meters approximately up into the air to drop them? Couldn't they get it to crack better 6 or 7 or 10 meters up in the air, or would it be really any better than flying 4 meters up in the air, right? So they asked that question, and then they also said, why not small whelks? What's the deal with that? We could do the same thing with small whelks. Um, and so the person designed an experiment. They literally created this like pole system where they could stick different size whelks up in the air and then drop them and see how long does, how many times does it take to crack these whelks, at different heights and different size whelks. And basically what was found is that the crows had figured out the optimum strategy for extracting energy from these whelks. Small whelks were harder to crack, and going much above or below that 5 meter mark, going up much above the 5 meter mark didn't affect cracking in any significant manner. It wasn't any easier to crack the whelks. It didn't take less trips up into the air to crack the whelk at higher distances. So that was, mostly pointless. It would just have been a greater energy expenditure for the same amount of payoff. And then if you flew lower, you would have a harder time cracking these whelks. So crows just sort of figured out what the optimum strategy was for getting this resource. This is really interesting. These are some other things that optimal foraging theory worries about. Things like, so this is the top here is looking at how do species approach searching for food resources. And this is a particularly interesting question when you think about pelagic birds because they are flying around over the ocean. Um, and food patches are scarce and they're not, your food is not uniformly dispersed, right? Like if you're a species that eats shoaling fish, you've got to find the shoaling fish out in the ocean, which is quite a task. And so there are two ways that birds do this. They either do it through true random searches, where they just fly around randomly until they find what they're looking for, or they do it through what are called lavy flights, described for the guy that described this behavior. Lavy flights are basically moderate length flights interspersed with short random flight patterns, and then another moderate length flight interspersed with short random searches. And they kind of do that over and over again over a range until they find food. This graph on the bottom. What's going on in this graph on the bottom? So this graph on the bottom is describing how long a bird should feed in a patch before it leaves and goes to another patch. So we need to look, A, B, and C all build off of each other. A is just saying like, you just have time feeding in a patch in the idea. You have these two lines. You have a non-diminishing returns line and a diminishing returns line. The non-diminishing returns line represents this like pie in the sky sort of imaginary situation where you're in a resource patch, and the more time you spend, the greater the food intake is, and it just keeps going up and up and up and up and up, and it's like an inexhaustible food resource. Not typically realistic over any significant amount of time. It's hypothetically possible. A very, very rich food laden area that doesn't have competitors present um, might represent something similar to the non diminishing returns theoretical model. Um, but we're essentially thinking of this, it's not realistic. It's sort of like infinite food is kind of what it is. In which case you would just spend infinite time. You would never leave that place, right? The payoff just keeps increasing. The A more realistic way of looking at food intake over time in a patch is by looking at it in terms of diminishing returns. The longer you spend at a patch, the more you're going to take out of the patch. And while you're taking stuff out of the patch, you're probably not the only individual feeding in that patch, and other individuals will also be taking stuff out of that patch. And so over time, as you extract more and more from that patch, until it's replenished through natural processes, whatever that might be, um, you start to get less and less from the same patch. And at some point, you got to move. Um, Optimal foraging theory looks at what, where is the trade-off and when do you move. What B does is it adds in a search time, and that search time is not a within patch search time. It is a cross patch search time, meaning if I'm going to go from this patch to another patch, how long will it take? How much time will I spend? And so B looks at that in terms of a short time to search. Now, C expands even further and says, what about if it's a long time to search? Note that the light blue line here is a tangential line to the diminishing returns curve, to our gain curve. And you see that little like dotted line that comes up and it meets at the point where the two lines meet. That's the optimal time to spend in that patch, where that tangential line is. That's the tangential point, right where the two lines meet. Look at, so I'll just use my mouse here. Let's look at, here's the optimal time to spend in the patch given this short search time, and the optimal time to spend in the patch given this long search time. Look where these points fall on the curve. If I took this point and plotted it from C and plotted it back to B, it would fall about right here, right? So what does that tell you then? That tells you when you have long search times, meaning long times to find new patches, you should spend a greater amount of time feeding in the patch you're already feeding in. It's pretty cool. The graph on the right is showing an example of all of this with the common eider. Common eiders, because they dive, they have to breathe when they're on the surface. They have to load oxygen up into their bodies and then dive. Loading oxygen can be thought of as a search time. It's a sort of cost in between each dive, which represents hunting within a patch. And what you can see from this graph is that longer pause lengths, which are like search times, are found with longer dive lengths are found with longer pause lengths. So pause lengths are like search times. Dive lengths are like the actual foraging within a patch, right? It follows this pattern exactly as B and C show. The longer search time, that is pause length, that you have, the longer time you spend diving. So this predictive model that optimal foraging theory suggests can be seen in these common eiders. So most of that discussion is surrounding individuals and how they'll make decisions. But we can also look at how group dynamics feed into this decision-making process. And so we can do this through what's called evolutionary game theory. And what game theory sort of predicts is that you have to have, if you have two opposing strategies, you have to strike a balance in those strategies, and that is feeding strategies within a group, or basically everyone ends up losing. So if we imagine a group of birds, and you have thieves, and you have resource finding birds. The thieves, if you're an individual and you're the only thief in the group and all the other birds are out finding the food, and you can just go and take the food every once in a while when they find it, and that keeps you fed. That's pretty advantageous. You don't have to do that much work, right? They find the food, you just steal a little bit of it. What if there are 2 thieves? What if there are 10 thieves? What if there are 100 thieves? As the number of thieves increases, competition increases, right? At some point, it's going to pay off to not be a thief anymore and just go find your own food. That's what game theory is talking about. Striking the balance between the number of thieves in a group versus the number of actively foraging, food finding individuals. When you're the only thief, again, you've got it made. You're not competing with other thieves, and you don't have to go spend energy to find food. But when there's too many thieves, it becomes a big problem. Here we have an example with the scaly-breasted munoz. And what you can see in this graph, so the way this experiment was done is researchers built an enclosure with a divider in it. They trained all the birds when they wanted food to pump a lever, and the lever, when they pumped it, would release food. The divider only had a lever on one side, but whenever the lever was pulled, both sides would have some food dispersed to them. And then they put different ratios of birds on either side of the divider. The side that had a lever were essentially producers. They were the food finding individuals in the group. And the side without the lever had scroungers, or kind of like thieves in our earlier example, where they waited for the other side to find food and then they took some of it. And what they found is on the side with producers, those birds, because they were all manually going and finding their food, in this case pumping the lever when they wanted food, um, they didn't have any significant change in feeding rate, no matter how many individuals were on that side, because you could always go pump the lever again. But as you increased the number of scroungers, predictably, the feeding rate decreased in that group. Um, and so what this tells you is just what we were talking about, that it is good right here when you're the only thief in the group. It's good to be the thief. You actually, in this case, they had a feeding rate that was higher than any of the producers, right? When there were just a couple of these thieves, these scroungers, in this situation, their feeding rate was about the same as the producers, and they didn't have to spend much energy. So that's still a win for the scroungers. Even at 3, not a huge difference. If you look at the energy expenditure for finding food versus the payoff, probably still a win. But what about as you get down to 4, 5, and 6 individuals on the scrounging side? They really start the feeding rate really starts to drop off. There's too much competition on the thieving end, and so they start to pay for that. And these individuals, 4, 5, and 6, had they the option, would certainly have been benefited to just go and find the food themselves, to go and pull the lever themselves, could they have done so. So this model just shows this evolutionary game theory in action in a controlled setting. All right. This last part here, this diagram kicks off into a major section of the chapter that goes many, many pages of examples and such. I am going to briefly go over this, only very briefly. Your discussion question comes from this. But this is a sequential foraging stages model, and it is just showing sort of how predator and prey have co-evolved to either capture, harvest, and extract resources from prey, or to avoid that happening, to avoid predators or to harm predators post being eaten in some cases. So we have search and recognition, which on the predator side is recognizing that's a prey item, that's something I want to eat, and finding it. And then we have on the prey side of search and recognition, this is how do I avoid being found? How do I avoid being detected? And these are through things like camouflage, that's crypsis, or epistematic display, mimicry, things like that. Epistematic display, if you're not familiar with it, is a bold advertisement, usually through bright colors, that says, "If you eat me, I am toxic." That is usually a deterrent. Most things will not eat something that is advertising being toxic, because that's a really good way to get sick or even die. And so that's search and recognition. Then you have capture and extraction. And these are different methodologies that predators use to actually capture their prey, or extract their prey from, say, a substrate or something like that. So it could be something like setting traps. It could be various ways that predators immobilize their prey. It could be theft, that's kleptoparasitism. All those are examples of capture and extraction. Um, and then from the prey side, how does one avoid capture and extraction if you have been searched out? Well, you can have body armor. Make it really, really hard to actually get to you and do anything with your tissues. Um, a tortoise, for example. If you think about an adult gopher tortoise, there's just really nothing that can do anything to an adult gopher tortoise. Not for the most part. They are wearing thick armor. Um, Adherence to substrate. So some organisms like barnacles can pretty well damn near permaglue themselves onto a substrate. They're very hard to remove. And so for a lot of predators, this is a prey that is unappealing. The energy expenditure to remove that thing, to eat it, isn't worth the cost. I won't get as much energy out of it as I put into it. The next step is preparation and ingestion. This is the beginning of, it's basically tearing apart the prey item and swallowing it, um, or caching the prey item for later. And so there's only really one way for a prey item to avoid this situation, and that is by having a body that's hard to eat. I'll show you an example of that on the next slide. And then finally, the last step is pulverization and digestion. And that's all pretty straightforward, I think, from the predator side, other than maybe you've never considered the, the process of detoxification. So predators will evolve um, compounds to detoxify substances from a prey item that would otherwise be detrimental. And of course, on the prey side, then, one thing that you might suspect being a defense mechanism at this point is actually the toxins themselves, toxins that will make a predator ill, or even toxins that are lethal. Some organisms produce not necessarily toxins, but substances, physical substances like small, in plants, for example, needle-like crystals that will harm the inside of the digestive system of something that eats it. So this is not a toxin, but what you might call a digestive inhibitor. Under preparation and digestion, I said I'd give you an example of what I meant by an organism that made itself hard to eat. Um, so this is on the left here, a picture of a white-fronted nunbird, actually two white-fronted nunbirds. Um, and on the right is a Peruvian shield mantis. And this example is in your book. These pictures are not in your book. So you can see the shield mantis. You can probably tell immediately why it gets its name. It gets its name from the shield-like protrusions of the thorax. And it's this big, hard, rigid shield. It's wide. It is wide enough that a white-fronted nunbird, which specializes on eating large insects, can't swallow this thing easily. And the white-fronted nunbirds have to basically sit there and manipulate that shield and bend it until it gets soft enough that they can actually swallow the praying mantis. Um, and there's another species in the same range, northern South America. This is called the bright-rumped attila, which is a type of flycatcher. And it can, even though it also eats fairly large insects, cannot uh, eat this praying mantis. It literally cannot swallow the shield and cannot soften it enough to swallow it. So it's just a cool example. All right, so that gets us to the discussion question. The discussion question is based on um, that model that we just looked at. And the idea is you're going to choose a habitat that you're interested in. Um, Maybe you want to learn more about maybe a desert bird, or I don't know, a mangrove bird, or tundra bird, I don't care. You pick a habitat that you're interested in. Um, Choose a bird species that is within that habitat and choose a food item, a prey item, and then you're going to use that model, that sequential foraging stages model, and describe the sort of coevolutionary stuff going on for both the predator, the bird, and the prey item. I will say that I know some of you are interested in mammals and several of you are interested in herps. If that's the case, this is a wonderful time to get to do a little bit of herp or mammal research, um, because both of those are potential prey items, right? We're getting ready to talk about raptors here soon, but obviously many raptors eat small mammals. Some raptors eat fairly large mammals. Um, so there's the potential to do something with raptors and mammals. And then if you're into herps, I know I've already talked about species that eat um, amphibians and reptiles. So you have some opportunities on the prey end of this to do that kind of research. The only restriction I'll make is that the bird has to be the predator in the relationship that you're studying, and you could pick any prey item, but it must be a prey item that is suited to that species and within that particular habitat that you're looking at. And again, you're just going to describe them in terms of that particular sequential foraging model. The 4 stages of that model talk about which parts of that model are relevant to the predator and relevant to the prey. A couple other just brief things. You cannot use a species already described in the chapter. Once you get to that model, most of, not entirely, but the vast majority of the rest of that chapter is in going through the 4 stages and talking about examples and going into more detail. Um, the other thing is that your responses should compare and contrast your selected example with your classmates, both in terms of how the predator fits within the framework and how the prey fits within the framework. It is interesting to compare and contrast, particularly how similar birds approach things differently. Okay, so that's everything for this lecture. If you have any questions, please reach out to me.